Thank you, Craig. We're going to get into this text together. In one of my favorite basketball movies ever, a movie called Hoosiers, maybe you've seen that one, there's this scene when a basketball team from a small town called Hickory, Indiana, I think it's a made-up place, but they make it all the way to the state championship. And so they travel from their little town to the big city, and they arrive to play the final game in this massive stadium. And the kids walk in, and they're awed by the size of everything. They're like kind of wandering around. They're like they're staring up at the stands, thousands of seats waiting to be filled. And they're kind of standing at one end of the court. And their coach, Gene Hackman, I think it is, takes out a tape measure, and he begins to measure out the distance from the free throw line to the backboard. And he stands at one end, he asks one player, well, what does the tape measure read? And the player says 15 feet. Then he gets one player to go on the shoulders of another player, and together they measure the height of the rim, 10 feet. And Hackman turns to his team and he says this, I think you'll find this court has the exact same measurements as our gym back in Hickory. And they laugh, and Hackman says, go get dressed for practice. And the point is that the Hickory basketball team, they don't need to be intimidated by the size of the gym or the surroundings. They can play the same way they always have. In the opening paragraphs of Daniel and his friends find themselves in a new, very intimidating, large place. The sounds are different, the smells are different, the food is different, the literature is different, the king is different, the expectations have changed. This new empire would have been profoundly intimidating and intoxicating. And the question for Daniel and his friends and the readers like us is God in Babylon like he was in Israel? If you're a Jew, can you live the same way? Does it still work for a person to believe in God even if they live in Babylon? Is the rim still 10 feet high? Is the free throw line still 15 feet away? And what we learn here in chapter 1 is everything is going to change in Babylon except God. Everything is different in Babylon except God. Despite appearances, God is present. He's working the same as he always has. And I want to point out to you 3 ways God is present in this story. It'll form our outline today. 3 ways God's present in the story. First, he's present in his sovereign role. Second, he's present in his silent role. And third, he's present in a subversive role. So sovereign, silent, and subversive. But a very neat feature of this text is that 3 times in chapter 1, it says God gave something. And each time God gives something, that's actually where our points is going to come from. So kids, if you want a fun challenge while I'm talking, see if you can find the phrase God gave in 3 different places in the scripture reading. So how is God present in his sovereign role? Well, the book opens by connecting us to some broader geopolitical realities. The narrator says it's the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Jehoiakim was the 2nd king after Josiah. Josiah was one of the great kings of Judah. The nation experienced this great religious revival under his rule. But Josiah unfortunately lived during the time of the rise and fall of some great empires. Assyria, which had ruled the Middle East for a while, they were declining. And so they had allied with Egypt, and they were fighting against the rising Babylonian Empire. And Judah geographically is like right in the middle of all this. And so they get swept up into it. They side with rising Babylon. They go out to fight an Egyptian army who's on their way to aid the Assyrians and so on. But King Josiah dies in the battle with the Egyptians. And they put his son Jehoahaz in his place. Jehoahaz does not do well. 3 months only. The Egyptians come and depose him. And in his place, they anoint this guy named Eliakim that they rename Jehoiakim, which is the name we see in verse 1. So Jehoiakim is a puppet king for Egypt. Judah has switched sides in this battle of empires, but then Babylon invades Judah. They're just getting beat up from all sides, and Jehoiakim switches alliances back, promising now to serve Nebuchadnezzar again. This is the event referred to in verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar has invaded. He's besieged Jerusalem. He's about to take it, and so Jehoiakim is like, okay, I'll join your team, presumably to avoid being destroyed. What I want you to notice, though, amongst this sort of geopolitical shifting sands storm is the theological commentary that Daniel chapter 1 offers. Look at verse 2. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into that's Nebuchadnezzar's hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. Who is responsible, according to the text, who's responsible for the conquering of Judah? It's not Nebuchadnezzar, it's God. God is the one to whom it is attributed. Why does God do that? Seems like a weird God move. Well, over and over, exile was a promised punishment for disobedience to God. Leviticus 26:33, God says, if you will not listen to me, but walk contrary to me, I will scatter you among the nations. Listen to Isaiah 39, verse 6. God is speaking to a previous king of Judah named Hezekiah. He says, behold, the days are coming when all that's in your house and all that your fathers have stored up shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord, and some of your own sons, whom you father, shall be taken away, and they shall become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. So what is happening in this invasion by Nebuchadnezzar? What's happening is God is faithfully fulfilling his promises to Judah. Now, we don't often like to think about God's faithfulness in this way. I think we prefer, most of us at least, prefer to meditate on God's faithfulness to love us and forgive us and never leave us. Those are all true. Those are all good things to think about. But here we learn, or we're reminded, God's faithfulness has two edges to it. As surely as God is faithful to all his positive promises, he's also faithful when he says there are consequences to your sin. And God does not change. He's not fickle. He does not promise one thing today and then maybe tomorrow it will be something else. You know, if you're a sports fan, as I am, you know that one day your team can be great and another day your team can play horribly. You turn on the game and you're like, which team is going to show up tonight? Is it the team that's going to play well or the team that's going to play poorly? That's, of course, part of the appeal of sports. We don't know the outcome in advance. God is not like a sports team, though, who has an off night. He always comes through. And unfortunately for Judah, he comes through. The sins of the past, this constant abandonment of God, it's now being paid off. God's sovereignty, his faithfulness is on display. Even though God knows it's going to cost him something in the eyes of humanity. Did you see the end of verse 2? It's an important line. King Nebuchadnezzar takes some of the vessels of the house of God and puts them in the house of his God, a god named Marduk. Now, that can seem innocuous to us, like, well, that was just where the gold was or something like that. I can assure you, though, ancient people thought differently because they believed in the gods. They believed in the power and the fighting of the gods. And to them, if you stole the important things from one god and gave them to another, well, that was a sign about which god was stronger. And so in the eyes of the world, the invasion of Jerusalem, the plundering of the temple, it was proof Marduk was superior to Yahweh. The god of the Babylonians won. They fought, and Marduk won. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are following the World Juniors. There's a curious thing that happens with the World Juniors and with the Olympics, especially in Canada. If our hockey team loses, if the juniors lose, what do we say? We say, we lost. And if they win, what do we say? We say, we won. Why? Because as a nation, we are identified with the team. They are us and we are them. Israel, of course, they didn't have a hockey team, but they were identified with their God. If the nation loses, Yahweh loses. If the Babylonians win, Marduk wins. So God gives his people and his sort of temple furniture into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, knowing how it would look in the eyes of the nations. He knew that in the land of Shinar, they'd be singing, some version of Praise Marduk from whom all blessings flow or whatever. They're going to be celebrating this victory. And I think the narrator shows us that the sovereignty of God, it's a humble sovereignty. God's present, even in Israel's defeat, keeping his promises, knowing how it would look. Friends, God is not absent from the difficult parts of your life or mine. When we suffer, when consequences from sin arise, when our enemies win, if we make an error that leads to some kind of setback, none of that means God has abandoned us. Sometimes God allows, sometimes God sends his people to Babylon. Sometimes he allows himself to be humbled in the eyes of the world, so it seems like our modern gods of money, power, or success, or whatever, are ascendant. But the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Part 2. God present in his silent role. So Nebuchadnezzar had laid siege to Jerusalem, Jehoiakim caves. Nebuchadnezzar pillages the temple. We've covered that. Now he sends his chief eunuch, this guy named Ashpenaz, to find the cream of the crop of Israelite youth and bring them back to Babylon. This is apparently a common Babylonian tactic. Ashpenaz begins a search. What's he looking for? What humans have always valued: status, good looks, and brains. Ashpenaz, he's looking for like people with aura or whatever. In verse 3, it says he's looking through the royal family and nobility. Who are the cream of the crop there? Verse 4, no blemishes, of good appearance. 2 statements about how good looking they must have been. In verse 4, good at all kinds of learning, quick-witted, wise, smart. Ashpenaz is looking for the beautiful, the smart, and the noble. Why? If you look at the end of verse 4, so that they could be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, another word for the Babylonians. So Babylon is recruiting the best and brightest to augment the empire, to give it strength. It's a strategic tactic. The Romans later do this to great effect. Verse 5 continues, the young recruits would be given special food and drink, the very food and drink of the king himself, be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the civil service of Nebuchadnezzar. And the better they are, the higher in the court, the higher they would be appointed to a role or whatever. Now, we can presume there were a large number of youths, but among them, and really the only ones ever named in the book, are the 4, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, again, if you grew up in church, you likely know the second 3 by their Babylonian names: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel, too, receives a Babylonian name, Belteshazzar. That name didn't stick, apparently. Everyone calls him Daniel. But he will be referred to in the book by his Babylonian name. Now, that name change, you're like, well, maybe it's just like a language thing. Maybe they couldn't pronounce, Hananiah in Chaldean or whatever. Wait until you hear what the names mean. So Daniel means God is my judge. He is renamed Belteshazzar, meaning, oh goddess, protect the king. Goddess referring to one of the Babylonian gods. Hananiah means God is gracious. Now he's called Shadrach, which means under the command of Aku, who was the moon god of the Babylonians. Mishael meant who is what God is. Meshach means who is like Aku, that moon god again. Azariah meant Yahweh is a helper. Abednego means servant of the shining one, referring to the Babylonian god Nebo. What's going on in verses 4 through 6? It's assimilation on every front. Their bellies would be full of the king's food and drink. Who is giving them their daily bread? The king. Their minds would be full of the language and the mythology of Babylon. Their names are now reminders of the triumph of the Babylonian gods. They're living in the palace or the palace area in a foreign country, far from parents and families and everything else. It's a luxurious, decadent, full court press on these young men to become Babylonian. And what's going to happen? Well, there's a very neat textual clue that happens in verse 7 and 8. The English does not carry the nuance of the Hebrew, unfortunately, but I'll explain it to you. The same Hebrew word, this word sim, is used 3 times in verse 7 and 8. And it means, it's a verb. It means to set or to put. So if you look at verse 7, in Hebrew it says, the chief of the eunuchs sets names on them. He puts names on them. And he set for Daniel Belteshazzar. But if you look at verse 8, in Hebrew it says, but Daniel set it upon his heart that he would not defile himself. What's the point? The regime has its mind on converting the youths. Daniel has set his own mind on something different. They set their mind to do one thing. Daniel sets his mind to do something else. He's not going to get swallowed up. He has this defensive posture rooted in what we will see in a deep faith in God. And we quickly learn here there is a difference from Babylon being outside of you and Babylon getting inside of you. Faith can survive as long as the regime is only outside. It's really fascinating. It doesn't seem there's anything morally objectionable going on with the assimilation program. Daniel says he doesn't want to be defiled by the food and drink, but the food and wine that he rejects don't seem to have a basis in Jewish law anywhere. Daniel doesn't make any similar objections to learning the language or the literature of Babylon. He doesn't ask for any exceptions with his living arrangements. But Daniel understands there is a defensive posture to cultural assimilation. The point is to resist at some point. to find a way, to find a place where he could trust God with his future. And look how he goes about it. He doesn't take a grandstand. He doesn't launch a protest. He goes to Ashpenaz and says, hey, can I have permission? Can your servants have permission not to eat the king's food and drink? And now in verse 9, God shows up. It's our second God gave. So as surely as God gave Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, now he gives Daniel favor and compassion in the eyes of the chief of the eunuchs. Now, it's not a very obvious miracle. It's not like the crossing of the Red Sea or the feeding of thousands of people, but God silently works to help his servant Daniel. So Ashpenaz is like, oh, I kind of like these guys. I'd like to help them out. But he has a problem. In verse 10, he's like, I also fear the king. And if you end up worse off, the king is just going to kill me over this. Seems a little excessive, but maybe that's how the court worked. So Daniel wisely proposes the test. We'll see more of Daniel's wisdom throughout the book. But a test, notice, not run by Ashpenaz, run by the steward who took care of their food and drink. I think it's creating a little bit of distance and deniability for Ashpenaz. Like, I'm going to put this guy in charge of it. So if anything goes wrong, we can blame it on the steward. But he gives a 10-day of test, nothing but vegetables and water. Again, kids, how would you feel about that? 10-day only vegetables and water. And after these 10 days, the Hebrews looked better, and they have, I love the language there, they had fatter flesh than the others. Now, with our understanding of modern nutrition, here's a skill testing question. Does eating only vegetables and drinking only water, does that give you fatter flesh? No. It in fact would slim you down, not make you fatter. And that is the problem with writing a diet book based on this story. It's not about the Daniel diet. It's not about the vegetables or the food or the wine or the water. This is not written to say, oh, if you want to slim down. No, Daniel actually eats rich food later in the book. This part of the story is about a regime that thinks it's in control. And like, we have these youths, we're going to convert them to our thing. Under the surface, God is at work. He's at work silently by bestowing favor and compassion from civil officials to take care of Daniel and his friends, by making this unusual diet bring the correct outcome after only 10 days, which is not a lot of time. But here, even in chapter 1, Daniel and his friends are quickly proving to be wise. They're learning to trust God. These relatively small tests of faith are setting the table for much larger tests of faith to come. But I want to take just a few moments here to ask the question of what do we learn from Daniel's approach to living in a foreign culture that at some point seeks to impose its values on us? Babylon, of course, is much more aggressive and upfront about its agenda than most modern countries like Canada, but there are some parallels. The first thing I'd like to note is that resistance to a dominant culture can and often does take different forms. Here, Daniel's resistance is private. It's quiet. It's like a secret test going on in the background. Later on, some of the famous stories, his resistance will be loud and obvious. In short, there are different ways to resist. And historically, some Christians have argued, well, no, the only way to resist assimilation from a hostile public culture is to withdraw, to mostly leave public life, don't work in the civil workforce, don't work in the government. Daniel has no such compulsion. Or some other Christians have historically argued, if you have an oppressive culture, the only way to resist it is to do something with schooling, to homeschool your children or Christian school your children. Daniel doesn't fit that pattern either. It's not a public school argument being made either. It just resists simple categorization. The important thing we see in Daniel is an awareness of the culture and its values, and a willingness to take steps of faith to resist it. So awareness of the culture and a willingness to resist at some point. And so right now in modern Canada, if you work in government, you have to ask, what are the cultural values that are being pressed on me? And what steps do I need to take to resist them? Or if you public school your children, or those of you who are students at a public university, are you aware of the cultural values that exist and taking steps to resist? But also if you Christian school your children, or you work in the private sector or own your own business, or if your kids are on competitive sports teams, or you work in a bar, it doesn't really matter. The question is, what values in the places you go and the activities you're a part of, what values are being pressed on you there? And how can you take simple, quiet steps to resist their pull? The good news of Daniel is God can silently be at work anywhere. No matter where you go, no matter what your workplace or home place is like, you can trust him, you can lean on him, no matter the choices you make for yourself and your family if you have one. God is silently present in the assimilation school of Babylon. He's bringing favor, and he's protecting Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now, part 3. God is present in a subversive role. So they run this 10-day test. Daniel and his friends turn out better, healthier, and fatter. It's great. Everything thumbs up. The steward then changes the diet for everyone. I'm sure the other people were thrilled to only get vegetables and water for the rest of the 3 years they were there. It's a long time. But look at the conclusion that's being drawn in verses 17 through 20. What happens at the end? God gives the 4 success in their learning. He helps them learn the literature of Babylon. He helps them grow wise. He gives Daniel special help in understanding visions and dreams. We're going to see that later. And after 3 years, they all come and stand before the king. And at that time, these guys are the top of the class. No one can equal them. No matter what kind of questions the king asks them, they are the best. Look at how verse 20 puts it. He, that's Nebuchadnezzar, found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. Not moderately better, not a little percentile better, 10 times better. And also they are being classified, if you note, with all the magicians and enchanters. That's who Daniel and his friends are part of. That's their group. This is a group that uses magic, but uses wisdom, intelligence, skill, enchantments, all the rest to lead the Babylonian nation. This is the civic workforce, and they are the best of all of them. Now, what I want you to think about in this final section is the reversal that happens in this chapter. Remember where we began? This geopolitical conflict, a weak king handing over his kingdom to Nebuchadnezzar. The Israelites were this beaten vassal state. They had to give up their religious furniture. They had to give up their best and brightest. They were losers. Now what happens here after just 3 years? The losers have become the winners. How? It's not just natural skill. It's not just because the Hebrews have worked harder, because God gave them learning and skill. God's gift attends their steady work. Sometimes we get caught thinking that God's gifts mostly come to us out of left field. He gives us gifts and abilities that are entirely unnatural. You know, we used to be this one thing, and now we have this gift that's something very different. Of course, God can work like that. Of course, he sometimes does that. But here we see God working through natural giftings. They were already good and bright and smart, but he attends what we already quietly and steadily are working at. And by the way, if you're a student here this morning, I think this should give you great encouragement. If you are studying the dark arts of accounting, if you're studying accounting or history or engineering, whatever you are studying, you're not going to become a magician or enchanter, but God can work alongside you, come alongside you, whatever kind of training you are in, and help you succeed in them. But the point, not for your glory. It's not for the glory of Daniel and his friends. God has much bigger plans in Babylon. God is subverting an empire that values magic and dreams and visions. He is elevating his people to eventually set the table for the Jews to return to their home. Look with me at the last sentence of our text. Daniel's in the court until when? The text says the first year of King Cyrus. We're like, who's King Cyrus? He's not even a king yet. He is the future king of Persia. Who's the king right now? Nebuchadnezzar. Of what country or what nation? Babylon. Well, if you know some of your history, during the first year of King Cyrus, do you know what happens? He conquers Babylon and he issues what's now known as the Edict of Restoration. And the first wave of Jews return home from Babylon to Judah and begin to rebuild both Jerusalem and the temple. What's the point of verse 21? It's this: kingdoms rise and fall, empires rise and fall, emperors rise and fall, assimilation programs, they come and go. God's people endure. How? Why? Because God is with them wherever they go. God is present in Babylon. He's faithful in Babylon. Look, sometimes the message of the book of Daniel gets reduced to be like Daniel and you'll succeed. That's not the message of the book of Daniel. First of all, the more you read it, the more you're like, I can't dare to be a Daniel. He's extraordinary. He's beyond what most of us could ever kind of hope for. But the message of the book is God is faithful. He's faithful to Daniel. He's faithful to his friends. He's also faithful to really the tens of thousands of Jews who are not named, who weren't as brave, who weren't as bold, weren't as highly placed as Daniel and his friends. Look, our salvation ultimately rests not on how much Daniel we can summon up in ourselves. Our salvation rests, friends, we say this all the time, in the goodness of God who loves us and is faithful to us as we seek to do our best to live wisely and well in our own version of Babylon. And so may the God who loved and was faithful to Daniel and his friends have mercy upon us. Let's pray together.